Tonight, on History, So It Doesn't Repeat, we feature a history-connected research session to identify common participants in MKUltra, the psychedelic revolution, public schooling, and social control. Though some take a shortcut to thinking, we'll learn about the validity, substance, and artifacts backing the research. Learning's the answer. What's the question? Here's your host and navigator, Richard Grove. It's time to study history, so it doesn't repeat.
Good evening and welcome back to History, So It Doesn't Repeat. Tonight we've got a cognitively stimulating history-connected episode where I'll be joined by a few fellow researchers to compare and contrast our respective maps of reality in the search to dismiss the arbitrary and focus in on the substantial. Joining me tonight via Skype to engage in this fact-finding journey from Southern California is the Gnostic media mogul himself, Jan Irvin, host of the Gnostic Media podcast and, of course, creator of GnosticMedia.com. And joining us from Southern Illinois is forensic historian Kevin Cole, who was recently featured in our discussion on the classical trivium as mind control versus the trivium method as self-liberation. Both Jan and Kevin are members of the Tragedy and Hope online research community, so if after viewing this you'd like to join in on the discussion or ask them questions individually, you can click on the Tragedy and Hope community tab at tragedyandhope.com. Tonight I'm specifically interested in presenting you with some interesting and useful maps of history of how the mind is harnessed to create human resources, taking the painstaking research of Jan Irvin on MKUltra, the psychedelic revolution, and social control, and comparing and contrasting that with the diligent and in-depth research of Kevin Cole on the classical trivium, the Yale Institute of Human Relations, and the psychology of control. And with all that being said, let's kick off this research session. Jan and Kevin, welcome to the studio.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks for having me on the show.
Kevin, welcome back to the studio.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
As you remember, Kev, a couple weeks ago when you were sitting over here, we talked about the classical trivium as a method of historical mind control and juxtaposed it to trivium method as we learned about in the Gnostic Media podcast. So I thought it was only fitting to have Jan, since he was interviewing Gene and studying the trivium first, to come on, give us a little feedback. But specifically, I wanted to talk to Jan first about his discovery of something called MKUltra Subproject 58. So Jan, if you could just give Kevin and I like a 5-minute overview of what you found out, I'd like to dig into it from there and see what we can discover.
Well, MKUltra Subproject 58 happens to be what we know as the Life magazine article of May 13, 1957, Seeking the Magic Mushroom, that is one of the leading causes, including Aldous Huxley's books and a few other things, to launch the psychedelic revolution, essentially. And this Life magazine article was written by Gordon Wasson, who was the vice president of propaganda for J.P. Morgan Bank. And essentially what we found, and the story is that there was a CIA agent, James Moore, who approached Wasson and offered the $2,000, and Wasson was unwitting, but we find in the CIA archives for MKUltra that Wasson had actually requested the money, and not only that, but the CIA had paid for all of the camera equipment. Now, there is one word in the document from the CIA, there's 9 pages there in Subproject 58, which became the Life magazine article, and that word is unwitting, and it claims that Gordon Wasson is an unwitting player in this. But when we see Wasson applying for the $2,000 from the Geschichter Fund, and we see all of the back information. We see the lies that are presented elsewhere in the media. We also see Gordon Wasson just 4 weeks before the Life magazine article was published. I have several letters between Gordon Wasson and Alan Dulles, the head of the CIA, writing between each other just weeks before the Life magazine article went to print. And Alan Dulles is inviting Gordon Wasson for lunch, etc. And it's clear that they were already friends. Gordon Wasson and Alan Dulles worked at the Council on Foreign Relations together. Alan Dulles was a director there. Gordon Wasson was served as a chairman there. And Gordon Wasson and Alan Dulles also served or worked together at the Century Club, which is a well-to-do quote-unquote art club that is essentially a front for the CIA. I mean, I've researched a lot on the Century Club, and it's got a fascinating history there. And in fact, there's been presidential races where, like Skull and Bones, every member running was a Century Club member, etc. And in fact, somebody just sent me a book earlier today on that, or I opened it today, and they may have sent it recently. But the Century Club is essentially the East Coast version of the Bohemian Club in San Francisco, which also has the Bohemian Grove out in the Redwoods up in Northern California here. So there is a connection between the CIA funding and buying all of the camera equipment for this MK Ultra project. Let me see.
I like it. Go for the documents.
Just to show you guys here, this is a itemized, almost itemized list of all of the camera equipment that was paid for the Life magazine article, and this is from the CIA archives from MK Ultra Subproject 58. So essentially what we're seeing here is the information that spawned the psychedelic movement, and showing that it was indeed a CIA project. And Dr. Colin Ross has another document that I was hoping to have right now, but I don't yet. But it shows that MK Ultra Subproject 58 was contracted out to J.P. Morgan Bank, and of course Gordon Wasson was the vice president of J.P. Morgan Bank. And then here we have a document that mentions that it's MK Ultra Subproject 58 and the $2,000 and everything, plus another $80 that was for the project. Here's a file that says that the MK Ultra Subproject 58, the performance was satisfactory, kind of like a little review file. Here's one under the authority granted of memoranda dated 13th of April 1953, the DCI to DDA, and the extension of this authority in subsequent memoranda Subproject 58 has been approved. So here what we actually see is Alan Dulles, who is Wasson's friend, and we obviously see Wasson in conversations with Alan Dulles. Well, let's see. Exactly 1 year after this is when I have, and I probably have more information to show Wasson and Dulles working together already prior to that at the Council on Foreign Relations. But essentially, it shows that Wasson's close buddy, Alan Dulles, is the one who approved the project. And then right here we have the document that claims that Wasson is unwitting. And we see the word unwitting there right by my finger. But what shows that Wasson was not unwitting, amongst other things, is he's working at the Century Club, working at the Council on Foreign Relations with these guys. We have numerous private letters in a large box down here that contain many hundreds of letters between Wasson and guys like George Kennan, the ambassador to the Soviet Union, trying to recruit George Kennan to the CIA, other intelligence officials such as the head of intelligence in Japan. And then in 1950, we've got Wasson writing a book called Toward a Russian Policy that he sends to Alan Dulles and J.P. Morgan and C.D. Jackson and Frank Wisner and all of these other guys, all of these leading MK Ultra, CIA, banking intelligence guys. Not only that, but as I showed last year in my article on Wasson, that he was working with the CIA. He was suspected by JFK researcher Bruce Adamson, who's written 11 books on the JFK assassination. He identifies Wasson in that book as CIA 22 times. We also have Wasson working directly for a decade with Edward Bernays, who is the father of propaganda. And I actually found a document directly out of the Bernays archives at the U.S. Library of Congress. And so it goes on from there, and essentially, and we even have Wasson running for the as head of the New York Stock Exchange chair, or something like that. I forget. I have to look it up, but one of those things. And so we have all of these different tie-ins, and in fact, and I'll let Kevin pick it up from here. Kevin had sent me a document from one of the Federal Reserve's that had information about Wasson there, and so this is actually one of our first tie-ins.
There's a document that was hosted on the St. Louis Fed website. It was January 2nd, 1954, and it was an interview conducted January 22nd, in which they were trying to get some information out of R. Gordon Wasson. And in this document, it details his involvement in the banking industry from 1934 and working with the New Herald Tribune in New York. But what they found interesting was that he always seemed to have an in with the people that he was going to cover. So when Montague Norman and Benjamin Strong, who were the head of the Bank of England at the time, and also very much involved in the Nazi gold scandals tied to the Bank of International Settlements that's mentioned in Tragedy and Hope, it seemed that R. Gordon Wasson was referenced as somebody that would know what the people were going to talk about before they came out. And I think that could probably be exemplified through the work that you found and his involvement with the Council on Foreign Relations, because obviously if they're talking about some of the foreign policy objectives, it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to see how they could plant somebody in the media to ask these questions and softball questions. So I did find that document very interesting, and there's a lot of parallels because R. Gordon Wasson sat on banking committees with William Benton, who was the head of the Encyclopedia Britannica Company. He was also a director, I believe, in the State Department and living in Georgetown at the behest of Nelson Rockefeller, who let him use his estate. So you have the guy who's involved in the head of the Great Books of the Western World program and funding all of that whole project. Also very much connected to the beginnings of what you mentioned with George Kennan, which is the Marshall Plan. And the inroad that these individuals have and the strong parallel really resides within the Office of Policy Planning of the State Department, which is where the Council on Foreign Relations have sought to change the foreign policy objectives from within, which is something that's talked about in many of the Rhodes Trust books on their own, that they hope to trade the State Department. So there are very real connections. I would love to hear more from you about the Subproject 58. If you have a summary, does it sound like that project is responsible for funding these publications like Life magazine itself, or?
Well, you know what we have with Wasson's boss, at J.P. Morgan, who is it? Davis. Let me pull that up real quick. And his boss at J.P. Morgan was one of the key funders of Life magazine itself. But this CIA Subproject 58 only funded the Life magazine article of May 13, 1957, that launched the the psychedelic revolution. And so there, let me see. It was Henry P. Davison Jr. who co-founded the Time Life magazine with Henry Luce and a couple of other people there. So let me bring him up here. Henry Luce, let me see, we got Henry Luce at Life magazine. That was co-founded with Britton Hayden, C.D. Jackson, Dwight Morrow, Henry Luce, J.P. Morgan and Company, Time Life, and of course, as I already mentioned, Henry P. Davison. And so this is what feeds in there. And interestingly, this camera equipment wasn't used just for that came from the CIA here on this document. Wasn't just used for the Life magazine article. It was also used for Wasson's wife's This Week magazine that came out that same week and went out to 12 million newspaper subscribers, such as like the Sunday Parade that you would get stuffed in the newspaper. So this goes out to an additional 12 million people. So it's clearly an orchestrated event. And no mention, they always claim that this event was a chance meeting by Wasson and Luce at the Century Club. Well, they're both members at the Century Club. There's not a whole lot of chance meetings at the Century Club. They're all intelligence and banking people. And I have a lot of evidence of Wasson and Luce and numerous conversations elsewhere. But so we have all of these conversations there to just show that the idea that they sell that it was a chance meeting at the Century Club is just impossible. So there's not only do we have evidence in Subproject 58 that J.P. Morgan was a contractor for that, but interestingly, J.P. Morgan J.P. Morgan, Henry P. Davison is a director at Time Life, and then Knapp. Joseph P. Knapp is another director at J.P. Morgan Trust, who is the owner of This Week magazine. So, we have this close little tie-in of Subproject 58, J.P. Morgan being a contractor for it, the two directors at J.P. Morgan being Henry P. Davison and Joseph P. Knapp, publishing the papers or the magazines that both articles went out in. So, it's a really tight, close little circle there.
I want to bring up from my brain model, I've got Henry Luce up here. It looks like he went to the Hotchkiss, which is a prep school, a private prep school. He's a member of the Pilgrim Society, graduate of Yale University, member of Skull and Bones, possibly a member of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, and he's taking money from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. So he's involved in Rockefeller Brothers funding, and I can't help but notice Rockefeller connections to both MK Ultra and Time Life. So there's Rockefeller connections in Time Life and MK Ultra. There's Rockefeller connections to Wasson as well as J.P. Morgan connections. So really, what you're doing by studying Wasson or looking into any of these aspects is learning about the economic, political, and cultural history of our country in the past 60 years, because Wasson was there with the May 13th, 1957 Life magazine that I have. It's framed in the office upstairs. It's so ironic that this element, this artifact of time, can hold so much meaning, but you have to study what's in it, and that's why it's something that I have framed. Jan also, likewise, has noticed the affinity of information in there, and he has a proclivity to kind of dig it out and figure out what really happened. I always thought it was weird that Wasson takes this CIA guy, photographer, to Mexico with them, James Moore, and you suspect that he might have been funded by the CIA or been up to no good. But now Jan's actually, through the process of using the Trivium method and using some FOIA requests to get these actual artifacts and evidence. Let's talk about the MK Ultra documents. From my understanding, the story that's told, whether by John Marks or Colin Ross or any of these other characters who have spent a great deal of time looking into these documents, that there was either 7 or 10 documents that were turned over as part of a Freedom of Information Act request, and that out of those documents there was a whole bunch more that weren't given out, and what they gave the researchers was purely accounting information that they thought would be noise and that no one could ever make heads or tails of. And here Jan is saying, look, Wasson asked for money and they gave it to him. So you want to comment on that irony?
Well, yeah, that's interesting, but also, what we have here in the CIA documents is we have like page 7 and 8 here with things like this, with this big blacked out spot up here in this corner, and then the signature blocked out down here. And well, if we have enough copies of the documents, such as I have here, I have a large box down here. Let me just pull one up and show you. But if we, this is my collection from Columbia University that they sent me on Wasson. So if we pull this up, we can get in here and we can start analyzing the type and the letterheads. So right here, for instance, right on the front, so if we hold this up, we can see this right here. It says 23 Wall Street, New York 8. Well, that's the corner, the famous or infamous corner of J.P. Morgan. So now, going back here and holding this up, we can see that black spot up here matches perfectly with that, as do, like it says February 28th. This one's March 6th, but I've also checked out the type of the typewriter, the font and type and everything matches perfectly. So we can actually verify for certain that this is this. And so we have direct proof that it's actually R. Gordon Wasson who is writing these letters on J.P. Morgan letterhead, which the CIA has attempted to blot out. But interestingly,
they're presenting you with a puzzle, and when they black stuff out like that, you're like,
exactly.
What goes
so
here?
Check this out. So here's some more part of the puzzle that the CIA sent me, right? So this is part of the FOIA request that they actually filled and sent me documents on Gordon Wasson. And when we get to pages back here, here's a nice letter from Gordon Wasson's his secretary to Alan Dulles. Oh, sorry, Alan, you just missed Gordon on his vacation trip to Mexico. I'll let him know that you wrote. So it's like they're all buddy-buddy and everything, and here's April 3, 1957, Dear Gordon. But anyway, what I wanted to show you here is that, so here's another one that the CIA sent me from my FOIA request, and we can see up here, it says New York 8 right there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's the rest of the address right there. So we have a matchup across all of these things that this is the same letterhead, and we can match the font and the type and everything. Typewriters were very telling tools because every single typewriter was like the rifle of a gun. It leaves an exact, or a fingerprint. It's an exact print of which typewriter it is.
The law of identity.
Right, and when we look at these black marks on these, and here's another one that's even more blacked out and jotted, but we can see again that this is actually Wasson writing this on J.P. Morgan letterhead again. The black spot is in the exact same place. Everything matches, and we can even match like the words February, etc. And so, and how Wasson signs respectfully yours. But speaking of which, I was just talking about that document that Wasson had sent to, guys like Alan Dulles and John Foster Dulles and C.D. Jackson, etc., his little book towards a Russian policy. This is it right here. I actually got one of the universities to scan it and send it to me. Columbia sent it to me. And so, we have all of this good stuff. And in fact, speaking of Wasson and Frank Altschul, and Frank Altschul ran, Project Mockingbird, I think. Let me pull that up real quick, and I'll shut up and let Kevin take it for a minute. But
that's all very fascinating. What's the context and the content of the document there?
Mockingbird. Oh, well, I've got hundreds of them between these guys, so we'd have to go through. But, so here is a letter from Wasson directly to Frank Altschul. In fact, I've got a letter where Wasson's daughter goes and spends a week at, Frank Altschul's house. And so, but, Frank Altschul was a part of Operation Mockingbird. He's a member of the Century Club, Council on Foreign Relations. Also, he's a member of the Pilgrim Society, which you mentioned, and he was the founder of Overbook Press, which is who published this pamphlet towards Russian policy. And then in the Columbia documents, I actually have a full list of all of the, it might be in a different folder here, but I actually have a full list of all of the people that they actually sent Wasson's little book to. And so, we have a detailed list of all the people that it went out to, so we can track them all. But there's, literally dozens of pages here between Wasson and Frank talking about the publication of the book and talking about, the background of all of this. There was a comment about Lefty Lewis there a second ago.
Well, I think the art, because the Century Club is supposed to be an art club, right? I think it's the refined cultural art of controlling human resources. And I think that
That's exactly right.
Right. So I think since the Pilgrim Society, the Century Club, and the CFR keep coming up. Let's start with Kevin. I know you've done significant research into the Pilgrim Society. I have the book Pilgrims and Pioneers by Sir Harry Brattain, in which he was one of the secretaries for the International Correspondence Conference, which was also part of the Pilgrim Society. I was just thinking that you could probably give people a more in-depth dissertation on what are the Pilgrim Society's origins, its goals and purposes, and where is it located, Kevin?
Well, it's located in New York City and in London. What you find is in 1902, there were 5 or 6 different organizations that really sprouted up as a continuation of Cecil Rhodes' Last Will and Testament. And you can find this in that it was originally a British creation, that they then got people in New York City to start their own New York Pilgrim Society, and they meet biannually, or they'll meet, at the Court of St. James in England, and they'll meet in New York with the ambassador to the United States. And what they were really trying to do is to try to give an inlet for some of the industry and corporations and those that were working internationally, on either the projects in South Africa or the help with the Spanish and American War, and these internationalist titans had very much formed their own type of polity right after the death of Cecil John Rhodes. And if you find you'll find that the head of the Pilgrim Society was actually one of the former brigadier generals on the ground during the Boer War. Which the Milner Kindergarten and those fulfilling the last will and testament through the Royal Institute were instrumental in. You guys were talking about the Century Club, and I do have quite a bit there. They were really created as a way to aid Great Britain, because during this period of time, internationalists on that side of the Atlantic were standing up and saying that Great Britain is falling to the winds of time, and the only way that they can be immortalized is for the United States to pick up many of its cultures and try to re-proliferate that. So when you look into the Century Club, you have Henry Sloane Coffin of Skull and Bones, James Bryant Conant was also a member of the Century Club, John Foster Dulles, Joseph Alsop, Philip Kerr, the 11th Marquis of Lothian. That's the Philip Kerr that ratted out the King of England to the Washington Post that he was having extramarital affairs and he had to step down. And then you get the guy that can't speak very well, and they make a King's Speech movie about him. That's his brother. So R. Gordon Wasson was also a member of this group. George F. Keenan, Henry Luce. A lot of overlap between the Georgetown set, which is a play on the Cliveden set that Carroll Quigley talks about. They had their own organization in Georgetown called the Georgetown set. And so you have Alan Dulles, but the person that strikes out to me as most interesting in the research that I do is a guy by the name of Colonel Francis Pickens Miller, who lived from 1895 to 1978. And Francis Pickens Miller is a Rhodes Scholar, and he's actually the one who picked Scott Buchanan in Stringfellow Bar to come to St. John's University, which is this university in Annapolis, Maryland, that reinstitutes the liberal arts canon based on the liberal arts committee that did the great books of the Western world. So what you find is that, today with the foreign policy objectives of the Council on Foreign Relations really being ran by this complex interdependence theory that is itself tied to the great books of the Western world movement and as well the Rhodes scholarships. And you add that to somebody like Frank Adeolette, who was for over 40 years the Rhodes Scholar Secretary in the United States, who said that the goal of Rhodes Scholars predominantly was to import the best of English education, meaning English education as a way to change language and as a way to facilitate an English grammar and a strict adherence to a kind of positive rights body politic.
Well, I also think that there's an underlying philosophy, because it might sound like we're rattling off a lot of random names, but I think the underlying philosophy of plunder and of collectivism. I mean, the next thing that we're going to talk about is the CFR. In my observation, the CFR carries out a very diligent role in the United States, which is that of introducing Fabian socialism and socialist tactics of dealing with property and individuals under the cover of free enterprise. We're just here to help, direct foreign policy, etc. Kevin, can you explain a little bit about the ruse of what the Council on Foreign Relations purports itself to be, and juxtapose that to its actual actions in carrying out socialistic activities, much the same as what they did in Russia?
Sure. Well, with the Council on Foreign Relations, you really find this starting in early 1919, where at the Hotel Majestic in England, according to Carroll Quigley, members of the Anglo-American establishment got together on both sides of the Atlantic and came over there and planned out what was going to take place at the Paris Peace Conference. There had been so much talk of failure with the League of Nations. They were looking for another way to create kind of a foreign policy feedback mechanism to the objectives they're not able to overtly accomplished through government action. So they create the Royal Institute and the Royal Institute of International Affairs with Lionel Curtis and those that had ran the Rhodes Trust since Rhodes' death in 1902, and the Royal Journal of Commonwealth Affairs as well. And the Council on Foreign Relations is really put together out of a New York club that had similar objectives, that was being controlled by J.P. Morgan interests, and they really just aligned this under the same banner at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. What they seek to do, from my point of view, is really to change foreign policy by controlling the conversation. And if you're controlling the conversation by bringing in the heaviest hitters of the people that make it into power, you're really controlling the type of information they see on which they base foreign policy judgments on. Now, in creating these overlapping rings or bodies with a high degree of organic unity to an internationalist concepts, they also did did this in a microcosmic level in the United States, where they set up councils in Louisville, Kentucky, in Atlanta, Georgia, and across the country. So in working with some of these other organizations like the Century Club that were also meant to help Great Britain at a time when they felt they were losing ground. So you see the objectives being moved a little over time, but what has stayed the same is a drive for an international polity. They want global governance. They are not afraid to say so. And there's no conspiracy that Rhodes Scholars make up the highest pinnacles of power within the Council on Foreign Relations. Richard Haas, the director, Joseph Nye, the director who created the international relations theory that they base their whole existence on. This what they showed to the public as kind of a soft power interdependence model, where they're trying to spread transnational bodies as a way to, by Fabian strategy, bring about their own goals. So, and a lot of this really, if you look into the Pilgrim Society, which you mentioned earlier, there's a direct correlation between the relationships that were founded between people like J.P. Morgan, Arthur Balfour, Marquis de Lothian, Walter Hines Page, many individuals, but more specifically somebody like Thomas Lamont, who was a J.P. Morgan banker who was also present at the Hotel Majestic meeting that is so mentioned by Carol Quigley. So that's a long-winded answer, but my best summation of that would be they're a foreign policy think tank that seeks to control the conversation and have succeeded in doing so since the early 1900s.
Well, I think part of the reason that they've been able to successfully do that since 1919 was their addition of Edward Bernays to the original founding members of the Council on Foreign Relations. But let's look into a couple of the other founding members, such as people who were early influential in the Paris 1919 Peace Conference and Council on Foreign Relations founding, such as the Dulles brothers. Now, you've got the Dulles brothers, who are Wall Street bankers, who then go on to fund and not fund, but to found what we know as the OSS and the CIA, the United States intelligence community. Once upon a time, I bought a very useful resource off the Gnostic Media website, probably before it was even Gnostic Media, now that I'm thinking back to 2004. It was called The She Who Remembers Archives, and it featured among 700 hours of this wondrous information that you can dig into and check out, was this researcher named Dave Emery, and I recall a presentation called The American Elite and the Origins of U.S. Intelligence, which completely blew my mind. It was based on a Harvard book, I'm thinking of two different books. I'm thinking of the Hugh Wilford book, The Mighty Wurlitzer, but it was the talk by Dave Emery was from The Old Boys, which was a Burton Hirsch book, which I then got. I sought out. It was very hard to get at the time. And then I went out and tried to fact-check all these things, and lo and behold, the origins of United States intelligence starts with Wall Street lawyers and bankers. Jan, could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, are we looking at the CFR or CIA first? I missed that.
CFR. Let's do CFR first.
Okay, so, as far as banking community, we have John Foster Dulles. I do believe that Alan Dulles was a lawyer at the time for...
he worked in Geneva, Switzerland, or Geneva or Bern, Switzerland, and Alan Dulles' job overseas was helping international companies...
Sullivan and Cromwell as well.
Right. He was helping them circumvent U.S. law. So before he was in the intelligence game, he was helping other companies kind of rape America.
Okay, so then we have, of course, in the founding of Council on Foreign Relations, Cecil Rhodes, Charles Seymour, Colonel Edward M. House, you'll like that one. We have David Rockefeller, as already mentioned, Francis Cardinal Spellman, interview, let me see here, we've got J.P. Morgan, John Foster Dulles, Kuhn Loeb and Company. There's the Ludlow Massacre is involved with it. Paul Warburg is there. We've got, of course, Theodore Shackley, Thomas Lamont. We have the Cliveden set and the Round Table, Rhodes Milner Group, etc. is right in there. And then out comes people who were interestingly, also at the Council on Foreign Relations, along with Wasson at the same time, include Arthur Altschull, who went on to work with Goldman Sachs. He died in 2002, and I have, like I said, letters between Wasson's daughter staying the week with them. And we've got C.D. Jackson, the head of U.S. Psychological Warfare. We've got Carol Quigley coming out of there. We've got Claire Booth Luce, who was Henry Luce's wife. We've got And let me see. Let me just hit the ones that Wasson knows directly. So Frank Ashtel, Frank Wisner, George Keenan. We've got Henry Luce as well. We've got, and there's probably a number of others here that Wasson knew. And let's see.
Well, if I might interrupt you while you're thinking.
Well, here, let me give you two more here real quick. Averil Harriman and Walter Lippmann. And Walter Lippmann, like Edward Bernays, is another key founder of propaganda and manipulating the public. So they were all right there working with Wasson, and then Wasson had a 10-year working relationship with Edward Bernays that I have the document sitting here next to me.
All right, so Bernays is a big deal, but we can talk about him in a second. Averil Harriman, that's a fellow Skull and Bones member of Luce's. You also have C.D. Jackson, who, rightfully enough, you mentioned was in charge of psychological warfare in Europe during World War II. So that's what he does during wartime. What's he do during peacetime? He runs magazines, because that's the same thing.
Sure, yeah. At wartime, he's the guy, the famous guy behind the Buchenwald thing. So there's a great tie-in there for people who want to investigate that.
When you say the Buchenwald thing, you're referring to the first internment camp that was discovered in Germany by Western forces, and he was in charge.
Well, the guy in the famous video who's holding up the pelvis and the all of the tattoos and all of this stuff, that is C.D. Jackson, the head of U.S. Psychological Warfare. So we need to ask ourselves, why is the head of U.S. Psychological Warfare at Buchenwald? Why is he the first one in there, and why is he the one setting up the display when they're forcing all the German civilians in to view this? And it raises a whole lot of questions there.
It does, but that's for another conversation. You also mentioned Frank Wisner, who is one of the co-founders of the CIA, whose son, Frank Wisner Jr., is on the board of Kroll Associates and AIG during this whole bailout scenario and 9/11 world, and their involvement in all these different frauds. So you see, in that case, at least the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Frank Wisner Jr. is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. But let's go back to some of these other people. I have on my list somebody named Charles Pratt. And when I didn't know who Charles Pratt was as one of these founders, founding families, the CFR house is in Pratt House. So the Pratt father had donated one of his many mansions for the use in this project called the Council on Foreign Relations. Interestingly enough, when I asked the questions, how did Charles Pratt attain such wealth? He worked for Standard Oil. And thus, either directly in the Council on Foreign Relations or indirectly through somebody that they've made wealthy, you see the fingerprints of the Rothschilds, of the J.P. Morgan clan, of the Rockefeller clan, and you see these different layers of history that are supposed to be separate and coincidental, then overlapping in what seems to be a pattern of people who know how to use linguistics very cunningly, i.e. Wall Street lawyers, and people who know how to make something out of nothing, i.e. international bankers. And now that we are studying the unrealities that they're purveying, this psychological warfare is the nonsense that they've been purveying. That's Lippmann and Bernays' involvement. So now we're starting to see some coherence, and the reason this hasn't been seen before is because of the corruption in the school system. Could either of you comment on how the education system has been obscuring this information and what you've done for yourself to start to reveal it and answer your own questions?
Well, I suppose I could take that one. I think the first thing that the compulsory education school system does to us is limit our ability to gather information in the world around us and to trust our own five senses. And in fact, science today will go on one step further and tell us that we can't trust our own five senses and that there is no truth in the world, that truth is arbitrary. So therefore, you might as well not check a citation. You might as well not count your change at the grocery store. Hell, your car might not even be in the same place ever twice when you walk outside to get in it. It would just, we all live in this complete delusional world of insanity and craziness where everything goes and truth is whatever anyone makes up at any given time. And so I think, one of the key things is getting back to the trivium method is learning that essentially what Gino Denning taught us, that the world is composed of nouns and verbs and adjectives and things like this. And when you look outside, what are all the things that you see? Well, you see trees and houses and street and telephone pole and these sorts of things, and these are all nouns. And you see wind blowing and bird flying and things, and these are verbs. And you see green and and light and things. These are, these are adjectives. So when we understand that the world is made up of these terms, then it's easy to review anything and everything that's around us and get a comprehensive inventory of the world around us. And so then we can, in fact, go through and, fact check. I do know, in fact, that there is a street outside me, and if I go lay down in the middle of it, chances are within 30 seconds to 2 minutes, I'll probably get run over, especially in a blind turn right here. So, if I can lie out in the street and imagine all day that, that it's magic and the cars are just going to fly over me or they'll never come or something, but, it's reality doesn't happen that way.
So what you're indicating is that the fragmenting or the breaking up of the fabric of learning through the school system, it destroys our metric for reality. We don't have a metric for truth. And if people are claiming authority, and belief to authority leads to non-resistance to authority, and juxtaposing that to existence, under authority you could claim solipsism. You could claim that there is no truth except for what strong people say it is. Or you can actually ask the questions. And I would rather not delegate away my feelings and my observation skills to someone else who's trusted to do that for me. That would be like a blind person being led by someone who might be able to see, but you don't even know. So I'm interested in this artificial scarcity of information that's created to help us be more servant-like, to love our servitude, to not even realize the shortcomings of the world because it's so much bigger than we've been trained to look at and see. But if you can break through this thing called the enkycleos paideia, the circular artificial limitations that have been placed on our minds, you can start to find out wondrous things and start to make connections, and that makes logic and reason lead to happiness instead of irrationality and frustration leading to failure. Kevin, what is the nature of the enkycleos paideia, and how can we connect it back to that guy you named of the Benton and Bowles advertising agency, William Benton?
Well, the concept of the enkycleos paideia, as discussed in the presentation earlier last month, deals with Isocrates, who sought to create a unified educational system or a general education to educate the intellectual elite or the intellectual aristocracy of ancient Greece, because they saw themselves under constant threat from barbarians, as they called them, or those that didn't speak their language or adopt their arcane rules of logic, because they saw as anybody that didn't adopt a specific way of thinking as being lesser than. So they created really what his importance is a creation of the enkycleos paideia, or the general or total education. And this gets carried on through the oratorical tradition, and it gets merged with this Christian concept of the great chain of being, or the idea that every aspect of human existence or the soul is quantified by an index of some sort. I do want to mention, if you're hearing that sound, we've got tornado sirens going off in the city here. So
if you need to take cover, don't let this interview take priority. By all means, take cover.
But yeah, so that's a little, the basis of the enkycleos paideia and the importance is it was trying to create a certain kind of body politic to perpetuate itself in a propaidutic function. And if people would look further into the kind of classical trivium model, and maybe look at a lot of John Taylor Gatto's work, because he points to a lot of these ideas without necessarily naming the exact function. When in Death by Pedagogy, he points out the beginning of general education, or a compulsory education for children, really starting under Alcuin of York. And this is also what I found, so it was fascinating to see that mentioned in that particular documentary. But what they did was they sought to take the children who used to be educated by tutors or preceptors and put them into a homogenized education system that would create a certain kind of Benedictine or monastic order, not necessarily Benedictine, but a monastic order. So taking them out of their homes where they used to be educated on an oratorical kind of relay, and putting them into a compulsory school system at the Palace of Aiken is really some of the beginnings of compulsory schooling. And you see how that gets carried over through time when you get all the way down to the context in the United States, where you had I.A. Richards and James Conant, both members of the Century Club, who sought to help Great Britain, wanted to send them tankers and all kinds of different submarines and many different seafaring technologies through that meeting of minds. coherence. So, yeah, the concept of the encyclopedia and the trivium really just goes back to a general education. This is something that was outside of the purview of Aristotle. Aristotle's purview was more connected to a practical science, and there's so much fragmentation on how this transmutes through the European tradition. My goal has really been to go back and try to connect some of those threads to give a coherence to what method developed at what time and how that translates into something we can use in our everyday lives.
As part of this organic unity that is sought through the creation of schooling and the use of language to control populations, you were talking about Alcuin of York. You can also go into Charlemagne, and how the colonization of Europe actually happens through the installation of language through this artificial circle, the Encyclopedia. I'd like to bring it up to the 20th century. We can talk about the foundations and their influence in funding both MK Ultra and the controlled demolition of the American public education system, or we can take a right turn and go into this organization called Union Now, which involved a lot of Rhodes Scholars and people who sought to bring that Anglo-American organic unity to fruition. I'm going to let Kevin take the first step, and I'm going to let Jan choose which way we go.
Okay. Well, with the Union Now project, this really began with the organic unity of the Last Will and Testament of Cecil John Rhodes, where Alfred Milner and Lionel Curtis and these guys got together, started the Royal Institute, and then you have a Rhodes Scholar come along from the United States by the name of Clarence Strite. And Clarence Strite creates this movement called Union Now, which is really taking a lot of the ideas that they already had about bringing the United States back into the fold of Great Britain, but calling it a union of democracies, trying to create a general consensus or a polity that is favorable to both sides. And you see this with the Pilgrim Society as well, how they go back and they buy George Washington's ancestral home, and they create a little mock ship that they say is their pilgrim ship, and there's all this symbology that really relates to the actual things that they get accomplished. But with the Union Now project, they wanted to create a union of democracies, or a imperial federation. You see the continuation of this today in the World Federalist movements. But Clarence Strite was a Rhodes Scholar, and his classmates include Stringfellow Barr and Scott Buchanan. Scott Buchanan is credited as the individual who rediscovers the trivium in our time in the 1920s and goes on to write poetry and mathematics, and wants to take this to the Liberal Arts Committee with Mortimer Adler, who really takes a lot of his ideas and creates the great books of the Western world. But the lineage of the Union Now project is so fascinating because it relates to so many of the organizations that we hear about with Jan's research, and with what's talked about in the Ultimate History lesson, and with, of course, Carol Quigley's Anglo-American Establishment and Tragedy and Hope. Stringfellow Barr, as a Rhodes Scholar, and Scott Buchanan become the head of the Liberal Arts College at St. John's University, and they're promoting this idea of a union of democracies. And then you have I.A. Richards, who's working with James Bryant Conant, who in the General Red Book, or the Harvard Red Book as it's called, they both say, Conant and I.A. Richards say, that they need to institute basically the trivium and quadrivium back into the United States as a general education to bring everybody back to a homogenized form of learning. And so many of these things over time have been accomplished, and it's not something that is not historically sourced. I don't know. That's where you wanted to go with that, but
no, I mean that's great, because the classical trivium is a process of homogenizing individuals into a group. The trivium method is the reverse. It's the reverse engineering. If you find yourself in a group and not thinking for yourself, you can use this method to get back to being an individual, to learning in whatever amorphous shape and exploring the world in whatever direction you want, not to learn this finite circle and then you can move on thinking you've learned everything without asking any questions. I wanted to tune into the fact that R. Gordon Wasson is an internationalist. He rolls with all these internationalists that are participating in the Pilgrim Society, Council on Foreign Relations, CIA, OSS, JP Morgan, you name it. But he's not only involved in all that, but there's also the book, Kevin will have to correct me on which one this is, Jan, you might know. Is he mentioned in Universities and Empire or the Imperial Brain Trust? Either way, it's about the...
No,
go ahead.
I have it right here. It's
Compromised Campus.
Compromised Campus by Sigmund Diamond.
Also, I think he might be in this one, which is Understanding American Education, Its Past, Practices, and Promise.
All right, Compromised Campus.
One thing...
Go ahead. Yeah, it was produced by Oxford. That's what I was going to say.
One thing that I wanted to mention that we need to be clear on regarding the classical trivium and the trivium method is essentially the difference is the classical trivium is an occulted closed system, whereas the trivium method is an open, unocculted system that actually shows how the occulted system functions. So, we need to differentiate between that. But you had mentioned I.A. Richards a while back. I.A. Richards, interestingly, he knew Aldous Huxley. And I. Richards was a big influence on Marshall McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan is the one who developed the tune-in, turn-on, drop-out theme for Timothy Leary. The theme that Timothy Leary later put out was actually developed by him, Alan Watts, Allen Ginsberg, and a number of others on Alan Watts' Houseboat, which can be heard in Psychedelic Salon, episode number 193, for anybody who wants to hear them all deciding how the meme should be used, which was essentially to drive teenagers into teepees and communes. And then I have a very interesting quote from Jolyon West about that. But from Marshall McLuhan, it goes to Timothy Leary, and then these whole ideas of influence, and then from Timothy Leary to Terence McKenna as well, and both Timothy Leary and Terence McKenna admit that Marshall McLuhan was one of their largest influences. Marshall McLuhan wrote his PhD thesis on the quote-unquote classical trivium, which was the title of his PhD thesis, showing that he was writing essentially on mind control itself. Now, I.A. Richards, he's got an interesting background. He's essentially the one who tried to develop a dumbed-down language of 800 words that people would use, and sort of like the Orwellian newspeak. Now, going back, that I.A. Richards knew Aldous Huxley. Aldous Huxley was George Orwell or Eric Blair's professor or teacher, and so we have a very close connection there, not more than a step. And so anyway, there's a tight close there. But also going back to the Century Club, I wanted to mention regarding the Century Club that aside from this going back to England sort of idea, what we also have here is let's see, Carlos Castaneda. A lot of the New Age shamanism stuff seems to stem directly out of things that Sinner and people that worked out of the Century Club. So this whole concept of neo-feudalism or return of the Dark Ages, or what Terence McKenna later cleverly remarketed as the quote-unquote archaic revival, this stuff all seems to be, aside from coming out of the Esalen Institute, it seems to be coming out of the Century Club as well. Now, Carlos Castaneda, while it's pretended publicly that he and Wasson didn't like each other, we have letters from UC Santa Barbara where Castaneda and Wasson met up for lunch there, as did Aldous Huxley meet Wasson there. B.H. Friedman, who wrote the book Tripping and who knew both Timothy Leary and Wasson, was a member there as well. And then, of course, again, mentioning Walter Lippmann. And so just using guys like Marshall McLuhan and the trivium, or I should say the classical trivium, we can see how it makes a very tight circle right back. Now, going up a step, and this is going on to the 20th century stuff here and how it all ties together, one of Marshall McLuhan's largest influences was a large influence of Terence McKenna, a guy by the name of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and we can hear him in George Hunt's Unsaid video, where actually Edmund Leopold de Rothschild is quoting Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Pierre, he basically came up with the omega point theory, which later became Terence McKenna's time wave zero, which and Pierre is also one of the key suspects behind the Piltdown hoax, and of course Terence McKenna created the stoned ape theory, which was also proved wrong by Dr. Brian Akers. He went through and showed how McKenna faked all of the citations, such as about visual acuity, to Professor Roland Fisher. And then, aside from Teilhard, we have this little tight circle of people. Once we get into guys like when we jump over from Aldous Huxley, going from I.A. Richards, we get into the whole deal here. Aldous Huxley, as far as I can tell, he's really the key guy behind running MK Ultra. Just to give some background, Emanuel Swedenborg came up with the term New Age. Now, Emanuel Swedenborg wrote a book called Heaven and Hell, as did Aldous Huxley. And Emanuel Swedenborg, he's the one who created Swedenborgianism in Brenathan out in Pennsylvania. And so he's really one of the key guys who founds all of these New Age ideas. He influences Blavatsky. He influences Immanuel Kant, who develops all the nonsense that becomes quantum physics. He also influences Ralph Waldo Emerson. We've got William Blake and William James in there. Now, William James, he's an interesting one. William James creates the Harvard Psychology Department right at the same time as Wilhelm Wundt develops a psychology department in Germany. And, of course, Wilhelm Wundt is one of the key guys investigating the dumbing down of education. He creates the PhD system, etc. William James, he writes the book The Varieties of Experience that really becomes the core foundational book of psychedelic research. Now, William James, like I said, he creates this Harvard Department of Psychology, and then out of the Harvard Department of Psychology is where we have guys like B.F. Skinner, who created operant conditioning and the Skinner box, etc. And then out of that department comes the Department of Human Social Relations, where guys like Dick Price, who later go on to found the Esalen Institute with Michael Murphy and Aldous Huxley again. He comes out of this department, as does James Fadiman, also out of SRI, who's the very last guy to do LSD research in the U.S. And we also get the Harvard Department of Psychology and Social Relations coming out of there. But all of these guys then tie back into the Esalen Institute and all of this mind control. And this is just going on from one guy who took influence on the New Age from Emanuel Swedenborg, and we can see how it goes from this same group of people, all of this elite mind control, Zionism, and all of these things. They all tie together in one point up above, but they all come forward and they spread out into these different ideas and different, such as, it's basically a multi-front attack on humanity itself.
Well, that's certainly a prodigious amount of connectivity there, Jan. There's a couple names I wanted to focus in on. We can focus in on William James and Harvard and psychology and where that all goes in a couple minutes. But specifically, you mentioned I.A. Richards. I believe his name is Ivor A. Richards. I'll pull up his webpage for those of you watching at home. He connects to Huxley, which is the psychedelic revolution. He connects to McLuhan, which is the classical trivium of mind control revolution. He connects to cybernetics and Bertrand Russell, and therefore world government and scientific dictatorship. Kevin, who is Ivor A. Richards? Why don't we know his name, and why should we know his name?
Well, I.A. Richards was born in 1893, lived until 1979. He was a professor at Cambridge University for a period of time, in which he was the mentor of both Eric Trist and he was a mentor of Marshall McLuhan. Now, I.A. Richards comes to the United States at the behest of Conant at Harvard University, who Jan
mentioned. You're talking about James
yeah.
Bryan Conant, as Gatto says, the ex-chemical warfare specialist turned educator.
Right, and he was also a member of the Century Club and very much in debt to a lot of these ideas of helping Great Britain overcome their military insuperiority that they were claiming at the time. That's why the Century Club went ahead and helped push through the sale of some ships that were going to go over there to help in their war effort. But I. Richards in particular was a supporter of the Union Now movement, but even before that he developed what was called New Criticism. It was a form of formalism, and the goal of it was to decontextualize a particular text that you're reading in order to bring about the organic unity of the text. Now, they did this by decontextualizing the historical element of that, and this is really the lineage of the division between literature and history within our higher education standards today.
So to interrupt you just for a second to explain decontextualization of history, are you talking about films or TV shows which might have historical personages, but the story has nothing to do with history? So if you disconnect the actual people from the history that surrounded them, their story kind of becomes meaningless?
Right, and that was kind of the goal, was to create a kind of a separation. He used these concepts of practical criticism, much like he used the basic English, which was created with Ogden, who is the translator of Wittgenstein's most famous works. Now, this basic English that Jan mentioned earlier, that we talk about in the Trivium presentation, was really to create an 850-word language structure and proliferate that around the world as a way to open up commercial interest in places like China, for instance. So they took this 850-word structure and he took it further. He wrote books on international government and world federation, one of which was called Nations and Peace, written in 1947, and he used the basic English language structure, which he intended to be a world language, to write this book and impart his thoughts on the United Nations, on the League of Nations, and the failures leading up to that. So what I found most interesting is that when Conant brings him to the United States, I.A. Richards says technology to the rescue. And you really look into what this means. And I.A. Richards was a member of the Macy Conferences, which is the creation and solidification of our science of cybernetics. He was also a good friend of Norbert Wiener. So when I was really looking into who I.A. Richards was and how he connects to the Trivium, I found a book which referenced how he was trying to bring this in as a way to usurp the national language that had become so strong within American culture. So there are many different threads we could talk about in relation to him, but the most important in relation to Tragedy and Hope and the Anglo-American establishment are his involvement in the Federal Union movement and Atlantic Union, which is the before mentioned movement of Clarence Strite.
So this Union Now movement, which is supposed to be there to unite Britain and America, reunite us after many years of revolution and misunderstanding that we would be under the wing of the empire. Ivor Richards supports this Rhodesian plan that carries out through the Pilgrim Society and Council for Foreign Relations. So you've got this organic unity that Richards seeks to create through Union Now and through controlling the language and taking away what made America a nation in the first place, to recolonize us through our language by changing the meanings and the terms. And his book that he co-authors with Ogden, C.K. Ogden, is titled The Meaning of Meaning. Do you have any comment on that book?
Well, the meaning really, precipitates this kind of idea of the basic English as well. It's just really about breaking down language to a technology that can be used for imperial fashions. That's more of what Winston Churchill himself said when he visited Harvard University in 1945. He wants to unite the democracies, doing the same plan, but it was through this idea of an English-speaking union. The idea was if you could get everybody onto the same page, onto a homogenized circular type of education or particular worldview, then you would create greater unity and bring about this, world federation. These are all ideas from many different angles that they were exploring. You needed to control certain elements of language. You also needed to take religious denominations that had become particular through their separated belief systems from the universal church, but they were really trying to use this ecumenical movement, which is very much tied to the great books of the Western world, as a way to bring that all back into one page. Now, you can call that a version of the Socratic method, or trying to create a synthesis amongst the wide range of topics that we're discussing, but there are very real connections between both I.A. Richards and the work that he did with the American Union and H.G. Wells. When they talk about Newspeak and they talk about this separation of the language in order to be able to deem who was unfit based on the way they speak and allow them into different social circles, that's really something that goes back even further.
All right, so you mentioned Harvard University. Jan had mentioned Harvard and William James. Let's talk amongst ourselves about the psychology of control, how words are being used to make people believe things that are not real. These unrealities then allow us to be controlled through our minds, and the bodies that we inhabit are harnessed as human resources. Jan, what was your reference to William James, and how do you want to kick this off as talking about the psychology of control?
All right, so, William James, he influences guys like Walter Lippmann. Again, he comes up. And so here we have, again, the psychology of manipulation. And William James also is the first to come up with the idea of transpersonal psychology, which now up in Northern California is the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. And the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, again, the name James Fadiman pops up, who I mentioned came out of that same Harvard department and also worked at SRI. We also have Robert Frager, David J. Hall, and Frederick Spielberg, all as founding members of the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. But this idea of transpersonal psychology itself is also developed by Abraham Maslow, Carl Jung. The perennial tradition influences it. The famous LSD researcher Stanislav Grof is in there, as well as the perennial philosophy, and Viktor Frankl pops up in there as well. And Abraham Maslow is, again, he's influenced by Alfred Adler. He's at Columbia University. He works out of the Esalen Institute, so that pops up again. He's a big promoter of humanistic psychology. He also promotes the New Age movement. And Abraham Maslow is quoted as saying that the Esalen Institute, which of course is selling their whole New World Order, New Age movement that they use to dumb down and control everyone, he says that Esalen became the most important educational institute in the world. And Abraham Maslow is also the head of the American Psychological Association when he said that. And so, we have some just really good tie-ins here. We've got the very top of American psychiatry involved in this whole, the selling of MK Ultra and everything. But, if we get into Gregory Bateson, he's a really interesting character. Let me see if I can pull him up. So Gregory Bateson. Now, he's one of the key creators of Cybernetics. He's also there at the Esalen Institute. He's influenced by, again, Aldous Huxley. He's one of the people at the Macy conferences that actually developed Project MKUltra. And he's married to Margaret Mead, who Margaret Mead then goes on and she creates a lot of the sexual revolution stuff that was also sold by Wilhelm Reich. And then, of course, that's where we get the Kinsey pedophile tie-in there. And, again, she's friends with someone who Kevin just mentioned. Norbert Wiener shows up yet again. And, of course, she studied under Bronislaw Malinowski. Basically, he's one of the key founders of the whole field of anthropology. And interestingly, he studied under Wilhelm Wundt, whose name shows up again at the University of Leipzig in Germany. And so, almost never do we have to go more than 1 to maybe 3 steps maximum to get back into the same group of people who keep perpetuating this stuff. But, Gregory Bateson, the Macy conferences, that's a really interesting tie-in, because at the Macy conferences, we get guys like Harold Abramson show up again. Margaret Mead is there again. John von Neumann is there. Kurt Lewin is there. Again, Norbert Wiener. All of these guys keep showing up in this tight little circle. And so this is Macy conferences is really one of the key things that they use to create the Project MKUltra, which now, as we're getting in hindsight, it's not just the mind control aspects that they sold us in the 70s, which was just one part of the operation that was vetted. They let it slide. But what we really know now is that the larger part of the operation, and that which was launched with Subproject 58 in Life magazine, the Seeking the Magic Mushroom article, is the psychedelic revolution itself. So that is all part of Project MKUltra, directly coming out of this same group of people.
Well, let's dig more into cybernetics. Cybernetics is first mentioned in Book 6 of Plato's Republic. It has to do with the helmsman, or the ship of state, being able to steer this ship of state, how to control many people, specifically how to control the human resources. It pops up again in 1843, according to Rhodes Scholar James H. Billington, in his book Fire in the Minds of Men, Origins of Revolutionary Faith. I think it's page 291, top of the page. In 1843, B.F. Trentowski and Michel Ampere in France both coined the word cybernetics. And then it kind of goes to sleep for almost 100 years. You find it in the 1940s and 1950s among Gregory Bateson, Norbert Wiener, John von Neumann, Ivor A. Richards. And so now there's a close proximity between MK Ultra, cybernetics, the classical trivium, and social control, both through Harvard's Institute for Human Relations and the Yale Institute of Human Relations. And with that, tee up. Kevin, I invite you to tee off on that comment.
Well, there's a lot to grapple with there. Gregory Bateson, as far as his involvement in the creation of cybernetics, you also mentioned Harold Abramson, and Abramson is actually the one who doses Gregory Bateson for the first time. And who is Abramson? Well, he was a key player in MK Ultra. So you do see where they were using LSD as a means to try to create what is basically an alternative form of cybernetics applied to the social structure, applied to people. So they felt like if they could give this LSD out to a large amount of people, it might affect a consciousness shift that would be beneficial for their own. Now, that's some of the theories that could be postulated as for motivation as behind some of these events. But I did find that interesting. You did mention Harold Abramson. He was one of the first people to dose Gregory Bateson, who of course was a key player in the Macy conferences. His father is actually, I believe, the first person to use the term genetics, and then his grandfather, Master Bateson, was actually the head of Oxford University, I believe. He was one of the key people involved in both St. John's College, I believe, and Oxford University. So, there's a lot to grapple with there. If you have anything more specific, I mean, Gregory Bateson,
oh, sure.
He did apply the systems theory to the social sciences. And when you look into, like, for instance, I would recommend people watch the Net documentary.
Wait. Yeah. You're giving away my next 5 minutes here.
Well, the Net documentary is fantastic in that I don't know how he was able to get so many interviews with these individuals. I don't think he told him he was making a movie that dealt a lot with Ted Kaczynski, or some of them wouldn't have participated, as many of them walked away from the interviews as it did go. But what you learn from there is that Ted Kaczynski himself was a participant in studies with Henry Murray taking LSD, and then he goes in to seclusion and starts reading books by Jacques Zalal on the technological society, and he's really, Jacques Zalal has got a lot of really great points about how technology itself kind of systematizes some of the problems we have, almost to a point where people are hoping for car accidents because there's a need for organ donations, and they don't want to fix that stoplight because they're dependent upon that organ getting to the hospital to help this, and it's a system that kind of perpetuates itself. But there are many connections between cybernetics. Obviously, the MK Ultra, CIA was sitting in on many of the early Macy conferences on cybernetics. There are many connections there that were highlighted and all watched over by Machines of Love and Grace, as well as the Net documentary.
Well, what we have, going back to Harold Abramson, is he was also in charge of Project MK Naomi, aside from working with the Macy conferences and Project MK Ultra and dosing Gregory Bateson, which you're entirely correct on. I do have that in here. And he was also close with George Hunter White, who is famous for
Operation
being
Midnight
a part
Climax.
of Midnight Climax, and also part of the murder of Frank Olson, as well as he was close with the infamous Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, who was in charge of Project MK Ultra. And so going back to, cybernetics and Ted Kaczynski here. Now, we have cybernetics. Ted Kaczynski did study cybernetics. Ted Kaczynski actually, and I consider Ted Kaczynski more of a victim of the MK Ultra, because at the time we didn't really know what the ultimate goal was, what they were doing with ARPANET, and what was going on at SRI with all of the psychedelic and simultaneous technology studies. Again, going back to guys like James Fadiman, who is the last guy to do research there, and amongst many others. But Ted Kaczynski, he goes on, before he goes up to the woods to live by himself, he actually becomes professor of mathematics, again, right there in the Bay Area where all of the MK Ultra stuff is going down. And so, we have that tie-in there. And I think, Ted Kaczynski is probably a key person who knows really a lot of the background on a lot of this stuff. I'm sure he would probably know a lot of exactly what we're talking about.
Which is why you're never going to talk to him. He's in a supermax prison underground. And wasn't he officially part of MK Ultra? I recall seeing.
I don't know if he is now in top secret coverage. It's because it's been 2 decades now that he's been in there. I think he has done a number of interviews though.
Yeah, what the documentary The Net alludes to is that Ken Kesey was a part of a similar project that Ted Kaczynski underwent. I believe that was at MIT, I believe, under Henry A. Murray. And then, they kind of go separate ways. You see Ken Kesey, he starts the Merry Pranksters, and then you get Stuart Brand, who is the guy that coined the term personal computer. And Grateful Dead, of course, is on the bus with the Merry Pranksters at the time under a different band name, I believe, at the time. And so they're traveling around giving high doses of LSD rather to unwitting students at colleges and at concerts and festivals. Right. And
it gets better though. Yeah. It gets better, guys. So Ken Kesey, he gets his first dose from guess who? Gregory Bateson, right? So who does Ken Kesey marry? Or no, yeah. Who was Ken Kesey's girlfriend? Ken Kesey's girlfriend when he was started the Pranksters was Dorothy, who became James Fadiman's husband over at SRI. Okay, so here we have another close little tie-in here. Ken Kesey also out of Esalen. Ken Kesey influenced heavily by Aldous Huxley, and he was part of the tests of LSD done at the Veterans Hospital at Menlo Park.
Sure, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Didn't he write that and then sell it to Michael Douglas back in the day?
Yeah, it seems like it, huh? Because there it is.
Just to interrupt, you got Ken Kesey with the Magic Bus. You got Tom Wolfe probably riding around with him, writing the electric Kool-Aid acid test. So they're on this bus further. You got Tom Wolfe, who's like an establishment writer. You got them stopping at Tim Leary's house, and that house was provided by the Mellon family. That was a mansion in upstate New York, wasn't it?
Right.
Is that where it was, John?
Let me see. What was the mansion called again?
I thought it was the Mellon Mansion. When Leary and Kesey get together, they were staying at a giant mansion.
The Millbrook Mansion.
Millbrook, there you go.
Yeah, so William Billy Mellon Hitchcock is whose place that was, and then of course Ralph Metzner shows up under there as well with Timothy Leary. But what's interesting, going back to Dorothy Fadiman, James Fadiman's wife. She actually works for the UN now, apparently making propaganda films for Agenda 21, ironically, considering all of the neo-feudalism that's being sold by all of this whole dumbing down and tie-in process that we're going through. And then here we have a tie-in to Agenda 21 here.
Well, I think what we are seeking and searching for is there overlap between the maps of Agenda 21, Cybernetics, eugenics, Fabian socialism, Rhodes Roundtable, Anglo-American establishment, Union Now type people, and the foundations that are controlled demolitioning American education. And you find commonality between all these groups. They're almost inbred. You see many people holding many positions at various groups that are all participating in various compartmentalized aspects of the working group mentality to carry out a larger plan that when you see all these layers overlap, you're like, wow, the psychedelic revolution isn't what it seemed to be. And there is still legitimacy, there's still things to be learned, but we also have to take introspection as to what we know now, not neglect any useful aspects that are factual and actual and on the table. And when you can connect R. Gordon Wasson and Huxley and all these different characters to the other people who are helping to make this enmeshment around the world of taking away sovereign liberty, of human rights, of your right to your own life, liberty, property, all the things that you need to sustain yourself. And they're seeking a philosophy of solipsism where we don't care anymore about truth. We don't have any metric for truth. Truth doesn't matter. We say it does, but we don't really support the whistleblowers and the investigations and all that other stuff. We like to just go with the flow here in America and not cause any trouble. And that mentality, that non-resistance to belief, is an effect of what they've learned from MK Ultra, not in the brain and chip, Jose Delgado putting the chip in your brain and wires and wireless. That's like hard mind control. what they've done through Ivor Richards and cybernetics and changing the school system, it's like soft mind control. It's like explicit versus implicit. Both ways were explored by these people, and they've, you know, had more of an obvious longevity to one where it supposedly cuts off with MK Ultra, and then they had this invisible longer longevity with all these other social memes that they've seeded us with until we start to practice intellectual self-defense, observe, identify, organize, and communicate. So in an effort to wrap up this fruitful research conversation,
let me just add something here before we do that, because directly under Agenda 21, I mentioned George Hunt's Unsaid video earlier, and the mention of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and Edmund de Rothschild there. Well, directly under Agenda 21, we get the battle for the fourth world, and you're talking about all of this control over the mind, and people need to have a name to call this amalgamation of all of these different control projects that they're using, and that's really the battle for the fourth world. We've heard of the first world, that's the U.S., you know, Canada, Northern Europe. We've got second world, which is China and Russia, etc. We've got the third world, which is Africa, South America. Well, what is the fourth world? And the fourth world is the battle for the collective mind. And so directly underneath the fourth world, things that are influenced by or come out of this are, in fact, and these things have to be taken all together, because individually, if we just see them by themselves, it doesn't make sense. But when we see them as a coherent whole, then a different picture is painted. And so what we have is the dumbing down of compulsory education. We have things like the Course in Miracles, which was one of the key things that the CIA and MK Ultra used to launch the New Age movement along with psychedelics. And, you know, we have critical thinking removed from public education and the removal of the fallacies, using the classical trivium or the misapplication of essentially to encapsulate people's minds. We've got the December 21st, 2012 meme in there, the destruction of the family, the destruction of the middle class. We have the entheogenic experience without the trivium method, the environmental movement, feminism, and I've exposed a lot of that with Karen of Grow Rights What. We have fluoride in there in the water. The Gaia hypothesis ties right in, and James Lovelock is right in there with Gregory Bateson at the Linz Farney Association selling this. Geoengineering, global warming, genetically modified foods, informal fallacies, neo-shamanism, the New Age movement, pharmaceutical industry, pornography, positive thinking, professional sports, MK Ultra, the psychedelic revolution, psychiatry, sexual revolution, the Council of Nine, UFOs, and of course vegetarianism, as Plato discusses 2,300 years ago, using vegetarianism to control the masses. And then of course we have wheat, which in fact I have a new book here. This one here, it's called The Bread of Dreams, and it talks about how the elites used ergot-contaminated wheat to keep the masses in the Middle Ages dumbed down and in control.
Well, that's pretty fascinating, and you mentioned Plato, who's always about social control. You also mentioned a specific phrase, and I don't know if you were aware of this, but battle for the mind was what I had just written on my page here as a reminder to talk about William Sargent, who was the heavy-duty influence on Aldous Huxley, who helped Aldous develop these ideas of the ultimate revolution, which play into controlling the fourth world, i.e. the mind and what you think. And the real battlefield, the real revolution is for your mind, and we can't do anything about that except be subject to it until we start to inquire and start to find substantial and valid answers. Kevin, do you have any comments on what Jan just transpired through this conversation?
Sure. Yeah. No. You were asking about the connections and the overlap, and I think that illustrates quite a bit of it there. What I would like to add to that is that the Union to Unite the Democracies, or the Strait Council, that was created by Clarence Strait, is directly responsible in the founding of NATO, both the OECD and the United European Union. The OECD, or the Committee for Economic Development, that took place out of Chicago with Paul Hoffman. This is the precursor to what we know as the unsaid conferences. So there is definitely a direct correlation. I want to make sure and get that out there to both Maurice Strong and the Lindisfarne Association that he just mentioned with Gregory Bateson. This is an organization that really pays homage to a fallen priory off the coast there north of England. And Alcuin of York, who creates the Trivium, also writes an homage to the Lindisfarne Priory that gets taken over by the barbarians as they attack from outward.
That's some pretty Wicker Man type of idea right there.
Yeah, I wouldn't get that reference because I don't think I've seen that film. But
John gets that reference. You know what the Wicker Man is.
Oh, sure, of course I do. It's one of my favorite films.
Yeah, The Wicker Man was the
1973 version, of course.
Right, yeah, you got to go with the original, don't go for the remakes. There's also a couple recent movies I saw like out there that are just like rip-offs of it. You got to go for the original, Wicker Man movie and sit through it and hope you're not the guy that's in The Wicker Man.
check this out, you guys. So a little bit more on the Lindisfarne Association.
There you go.
Tying it all into MK Ultra. Look at the lineup here. We've got Gregory Bateson, James Lovelock, Joan Halifax, Mary Catherine Bateson, Michael Murphy, one of the key founders of the Esalen Institute. Ralph Abraham is there. And Wendell Berry. We've got Elaine Pagels there. Dorian Sagan is also there. And, of course, one of their biggest influences that they talk about at the Lindisfarne Association is Pierre Teilhard de Chardin.
Well, that's pretty fascinating. Kevin, is there any connection between Lindisfarne and the Aspen Institute and Walter Pepke and these other characters who are espousing the noble lie?
Yeah, there are direct connections between the Lindisfarne Association and the conference on cybernetics that took place back at the start of the end of the 1930s with the Macy conferences. Now, as far as connections between the Aspen Institute, they're probably more. No, I'm not sure. I'd have to. Yeah, I'd have to look into that a little further. What I've found most fascinating with the Lindisfarne Association is that William Irwin Thompson, who founded this, he has no apologies for accepting Rockefeller grants, and he talks about how the conspiracy theorists have come after him as somebody promoting the Gaia hypothesis because he's the one who brings in James Lovelock and Lynn Margulies, who Lynn Margulies was pretty vocal for 9/11 truth, quote unquote, for a period of time before she died. I believe Lovelock and Margulies have both died, but Richard Falk, who co-wrote the books with David Ray Griffin, who is also a big Teilhard de Chardin fan. He wrote the comment. Yeah, David.
If Lovelock is dead, Wikipedia doesn't cite it.
Richard.
Yeah, who is?
If James Lovelock is dead, Wikipedia doesn't cite it.
I may be wrong on that. He may not have passed. I know Lynn Margulies did pass recently. I was pretty sure James Lovelock passed after that, but maybe that's not the case. But yeah, it's really a continuation of the Macy conferences, except more in a religious realm. What they did was Maurice Strong moves out to Crestone, Colorado, and they set up this kind of sanctuary for 4 different kinds of churches, and they bring in all these other churches as a way to kind of synthesize these religious notions into something that could be used for a global polity, because they see that really as the way to create their own metaphor, which is the book written by Gregory Bateson's daughter called Our Own Metaphor, where they basically see the world as art to be painted rather than anything dealing with a reality-based option where we have any real say in our own future.
Everything belongs to them. That's their philosophy, right?
Here's an interesting tie-in. James Lovelock is one of the key promoters today of nuclear power.
Yeah, well, then that would where people should look into following that statement is the Global Business Network, which is set up by Stuart Brand, who coined the term personal computer. They were just recently bought out by the Monitor Group. This is all a CFR operation ran by Dutch Shell and BP and some of the largest corporations on the planet. It's called the Global Business Network, and they're also, through Gro Harlem Brundtland, who is the head of the Unsaid conferences, very much related to this whole conversation. We could do a whole show on the ins and outs and nuances of those facts.
You just stated Stuart Brand, who's in the Net documentary, Gro Harlem Brundtland, who's a part of the Unsaid conference, and that turned into Agenda 21, the Rio 1992 conference. I also want to talk about, in respect to Agenda 21 and Unsaid and the 1992 Rio conference, This guy I call him Momo Strong, but his name's Morris Strong. He's a Canadian. He hangs out with Lord Rothschild at that Unsaid conference in 1992, where you can hear Lord Rothschild, or maybe it's a Baron Rothschild, one of those Rothschilds, talking about how it's basically their right to change your Earth because it's not yours. You just inhabit their place, and that they're in control. So I know both of you are well schooled on Agenda 21, the Rio conference. Jan's interviewed George W. Hunt, who had a famous proclamation back in the day that no one really saw, and maybe we can include a clip later. But
yeah, it's kind of sad that it took 20 some odd years for people to recognize his work.
Right. So let's tie this all up together, because now we have a finite planet with people who have overlapping agendas, but those agendas all have a certain, commonality to them as far as collectivism, as far as repurposing the Earth in their image, the fact that you don't have rights over your own life, liberty, mind, any of these things. They find nothing sacred, and they go after us, at the youngest age through education. So what is their overall goal? These people who we call internationalists or globalists, who are seeking to dissolve national borders and control resources. How do they go about attaining that goal, in your opinions, and is it logical and reasonable, as a closing statement?
Well, I think their goal is neo-feudalism. I think that they're using this multi-pronged approach that's revealed through the Fourth World information that I just read through, that is used to bring about this, not only to slow population growth or what they consider a threat, rather than empowering the population and providing them the trivium method. They use the classical trivium to control the population, dumb them down rather than empower them. The problem here is that the elites are only interested in keeping themselves in power, whereas if you use the trivium method in contrast to empower everyone, then you have everyone creating solutions, everyone partaking in towards these goals, and not just people who create bogus science and use sophism and lie to the masses. And, as you just mentioned, nothing is sacred. This approach versus one that empowers everyone to work together and find the solutions. And so I think that's really, their ultimate goal is to herd us towards neo-feudalism and to keep us dumbed down and stupid, to keep us from finding or discovering how powerful of beings we really are. Because, if we were really these tragic, dumb animals, this chattel that they claim we are, then why do they need to put us through the compulsory education system? Why do they need to barrage us with all of this mind control? Why do they need to continually dumb us down with propaganda and with all of these tricks and everything? Because, it's clear to me that they're worried that humankind will discover that we're the antithesis of what they tell us we are.
I think that's absolutely true. I think there's a power in our individuality that they try to wipe out, create a tabula rasa or a blank slate through the schooling process so that they can program us to be in their image. But their image is irrationality. Their lies and deception must always be maintained through propaganda and budgets and projects. That's why they're such busy little bees and care about us. I don't understand why they care about us. I wouldn't care about them if they weren't infringing my volition every second of the day and night. Kevin, before I go to you for your closing statement, I just wanted to note this idea of a mind virus or a meme in occult literature is called something called an egregor, and it's a type of linguistic device created by chaos magicians. Now, quite simply, these are people who use language to try to get you to believe something that isn't true, and you can defend yourself from chaos magic with the trivium method. So by having a method of critical thinking and creative problem solving, you can see language as a weapon being used against you, but you no longer have to be under its effect, because the words of deception must be believed by you. So literacy being the form of slavery that it is, until we practice a method of critical thinking, it leaves us at, kind of like not having a firewall or virus scan on your computer, and without knowing how to find knowledge in the first place, your mind becomes occupied with many unrealities and beliefs. And I think that's one of the main causes that's going, that America is being demolished so successfully right now. Kevin, how would you comment on the use of language to control human resources, specifically to get us to act in contrary with our needs for survival?
Well, I think it's been the model of modus operandi over time. This is very much a continuity that's been going on for 21 generations, with the creation of a general education in which you can bring a certain body of people, a certain body politic, or if those outside of that body politic become educated, you can bring them into the fold. And that's really where you get the fear of, teaching slaves to read or educating the lower classes to get out of their so-called sing-song speech, as Dorothy Sayers would have said it. So I think, language and education and information is always going to be something that can be leveraged against other people. I mean, honestly, we are all forced to do that in order to have professions within the society we live in. They get people to compromise their integrity and rescind that part of their own humanity, and then that's really, that's how they win. There's, people are operating very much as robotic versions of themselves, where they aren't really looking into the information themselves, and they're kind of espousing things that are pseudo histories of the actual fact. So as far as with the Agenda 21 and what was put forth by Maurice Strong and what their goals were, and it seems to me that they really want to harmonize all of the gender and water and chemical resources across the world, so as to when this global system does come online, or this neo-feudalistic concept does come online, that they have specific jobs in place for those within a model of sustainable development. Because even Ronald Reagan said that if some outside force were to attack the Earth, then that would bring everybody automatically to a consciousness shift to where they could act and move their agendas forward. Now it's very much the same deal. I mean, it's a race to a unified consciousness, and the American empire is no different than that of its predecessors, because we've long adopted the ideologies and class structures that our quote-unquote forefathers were very much aware from, ran away from, and were simply common sense.
Well said. Jan, thank you for being here today.
And thanks for having me on, Rich. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope that people will take into real deep consideration this idea of neo-feudalism and the idea that the deadhead may be a product of social control, the ultimate end goal of this agenda, rather than a controlled opposition, rather than an individual freedom movement, as many have assumed.
Many people have assumed, and that's one of the issues. I'd also like to have a follow-up conversation sometime in the near future talking about you and Cameron, George Estabrooks, who was a Rhodes Scholar, and Jolyon West, all of whom participated in CIA's MKUltra projects funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And I think that'll make a great future episode. In the meanwhile, I'm going to leave it to folks in the community. Jan and Kevin are both in there. If you guys have any questions or clarifications, we'll be happy to try to field those and maybe even have a follow-up discussion where we can get more in depth now that we've kind of laid out the field, and we'll let people get familiar with the players involved in this part of the story. But the story goes much deeper, and we're just trying to lay it out in a logical and convenient way for you to start to be able to dig in and grow in the right direction. Kevin, thank you for being here tonight.
No, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for coming, Jan. It's always good to have these types of research sessions where we can kind of get our personal brains together and see where the intersections are, and see how we can build this forward. Because I firmly believe that the solution to getting this information out there in a way where people can cogently understand it is to also meet those that we see as the enemy on a level of intellectual respect where it is necessary, and where it is not necessary is where you can prove that they are derelict in their reasoning. And so that's really it's really what it comes down to, is people to get together and understand the different forms of research that can be passed along. And I'm sure other people will have questions, and anything we can incorporate into another outline where we can kind of go through these ideas in a chronological order would be great as well.
Well, and I also think it's worth noting that most of the time when people are having reactions to this information, it's not the first time that anyone's had a reaction to different information being presented. The stimulus reaction is it's a reflex in your body, so you have to learn to interject thinking in between the stimulus and reaction, to go out, do your own homework, look up some stuff for yourself, get a general familiarity, and then, and only then, can you start to learn more. But I think that this is a great forum for us to be able to, compare those things, those models that we've built, and to draw some usefulness out of them, because it's only through the comparison and contrast that we can really come to a knowledgeable definition about how all these things work.
Yeah, agreed.
With all that being said, if you're anything like me, you really won't realize what you've learned from this discussion tonight until you take a break, let it marinate, then dig in, observe, inquire, and compare and contrast for yourself. Only then, through thinking about that which exists and what we've talked about tonight, can one come to discover reality as a daily process. If you'd like to know more, visit the Tragedy and Hope community and tragedyandhope.com, where you can listen to our podcast, watch our films, and participate in our research and development community. Until next time, thank you for tuning in and not dropping out.